Chapter 9. The Cabin in the Woods. The cabin we found, it came at a moment when I think we were both just ready to sit down and call it quits. We were hungry, exhausted, and so tired of running. I can still see the sagging, moss-covered roof in my mind's eye. In that moment, and in the days that followed, it was nothing less than paradise. It was a place of quiet and of refuge. Our bodies slowly began to heal. Our nightmares and fears quieted some. And in some ways, our hearts began to heal there too. Jess's journal. Jess began her day by stretching and, as Erin kicked out in her sleep, falling with a solid, painful thump onto the hardwood floor. Ow! She inhaled dust and sneezed violently. Erin shot up out of bed at the noise and cracked her head against a small shelf on the wall above. Dust and books rained down on her. Ow! Ah, crap! Both girls glared at each other, Jess clutching her sore hip, and Erin her injured head, before they began to laugh. It was funny, in a Three Stooges kind of way. They laughed, swore as their body parts hurt even more, and took a good look around. The daylight from the two small windows was weak. Outside, the rain had continued through the night. It was now morning, and it showed no signs of stopping. It made a quiet thrum against the roof of the cabin. The trees, which were still barren of leaves, shook back and forth with the strong gusts of wind that rattled the windows. Jess could feel drafts each time it did. It was obvious that the cabin was meant only for summer use. Without a fireplace or insulation, it was barely livable in the nippy spring nights. It certainly wouldn't be warm enough during a harsh winter. But for the moment, it was shelter, and that was exactly what both girls needed. There was one sizable leak above the kitchen sink, and another directly above the toilet. The one above the toilet had managed to soak the floor all around, and a small rivulet of water angled across the uneven floor and pooled in the center of the cabin near the oil lamp and the remains of their dinner from the night before. Erin eyed the wet toilet, grimaced. Damn it, I really need to go. She grabbed a bowl from the cabinet near the sink and pulled the curtain closed after her, and cursed even more as she realized there was no toilet paper and that the toilet was bone dry. Her bright idea of catching the drips with the bowl didn't work very well. The water simply splashed out of the bowl and showered her with small droplets which sprayed in every direction like a fine mist. She set it aside and let the roof drip onto her head, cussing and laughing simultaneously. You know, we might as well leave the lid open, she called out to Jess. It's dripping right over the toilet, at least that way there'll be water in the bowl. They ended up doing just that. The small stove generated a little heat, but both girls were worried about making it last, so they turned it off as soon as the water had boiled and split a large can of stew between them. With breakfast out of the way, and the rain still coming down at a good clip, they had little they could do except explore the inside of the cabin. Erin didn't have any shoes to go mucking about in the rain with, and Jess had no desire to explore outside by herself. They went through all of the food, canned, dried, and powdered, and estimated how much they had. They were lucky. Whoever owned this cabin had stocked it very well. With both of them eating 3 meals apiece, they had about 3 weeks' supply of food on hand. All the water they needed, thanks to the creek, a rifle and ammunition, the ability to fish, and relatively dry shelter. For the moment, they were safer than they had been in a long time. Jess took note of the dates on the labels. All of the food had expired within the past 18 months, but none of the cans were bulging or damaged. It was probably safe to eat, and the previous evening's meal had been edible enough. She wondered what had happened to the owners of this little cabin, and why they had never returned to it. Eri, you know how to shoot, right? Jess asked her friend after they finished planning out their meals for the rest of the day. Yeah, sort of, Erin replied. I took this handgun shooting course when I was 13. My dad and Toby usually went hunting while I stayed home with Mom or came and saw you, so I don't know much about rifles. She pulled the rifle out of its box and began inspecting it. It can't be too much different. Let's see. Erin began to mutter to herself. She found a tattered manual in the box and began to reference back and forth with it. Soon she was busy assembling components and digging into one of the boxes of ammunition. While Erin lost herself in the task at hand, Jess kept busy by putting all of the food back and then started up the stove. She boiled more water to make hot cocoa. The yearning for some hot, creamy chocolate running over her tongue was almost painful. The water was running clear and cold from the sink spigot. It was slow and had very little pressure. The fact that it was running at all meant that she didn't have to go out into the rain for it, and that sounded more than okay to her. The rain subsided, and the bright rays of the sun were peeking through the clouds. When the water came to a boil, Jess carefully dissolved the contents of the packets into 2 freshly rinsed mugs. Erin had disassembled, reassembled, loaded, and was now peering through the sights of the rifle as she aimed it towards a wall. "I've got it all figured out," she announced, and then sighed in pleasure as Jess handed her a steaming mug. "So it's pretty straightforward." She paused and took a cautious sip of the hot chocolate. "Oh, damn, this is good." Her eyes rolled and she grinned at Jess over the rim of her cup, and then noticed the sun for the first time. "Hey, the rain has stopped. Right on, we can go out and take a look around, maybe even do some target practice." "We aren't shooting that thing off until we are sure there isn't anyone around for miles," Jess interrupted firmly. "Sound like that carries, you know." Erin looked deflated. "But you can show me what you were doing. And hell, maybe we can try hunting something if the coast is clear." The girls savored every last drop of their hot chocolate, and then Erin pointed out and named each part of the rifle, referencing the manual every so often as she disassembled and reassembled it again for Jess's benefit. She took care to show her the safety, and explained how to load the rifle, and how to aim, and then let Jess dry fire it. Jess paid sharp attention. If anyone came near them, she figured she would fill them full of holes, and then ask questions. At one point, she swiveled the gun around, crossing in front of Erin. Her friend ducked, grabbed the rifle, and barked, "Don't ever point a firearm at anyone unless you mean to kill them." Jess rolled her eyes at her friend. "Ari, ease up. It isn't even loaded." Erin just stared back and said, "Jess, always assume a gun is loaded. Always treat it like it is. Otherwise, you'll end up shooting yourself or someone else. My dad knew someone who had owned guns for years. He screwed up one day, thought his gun was empty, and shot himself in the foot. Dad always said his friend was lucky that all he ended up with was a hole in the foot and not in the head for being so stupid. So I mean it, treat it like it's always loaded." Jess sobered and promised to be more careful, and pulled on the raincoat. Erin grabbed a blanket for a little additional warmth, and they both headed outside. The temperature was already rising as the skies continued to clear, and considering the sun was nearly overhead, it was also close to lunchtime. Neither of them was particularly hungry thanks to the hot chocolate, which gave the girls time to explore their surroundings. To the west was a small shed, more of a lean-to really, and it was locked with a sturdy padlock that resisted their efforts to open it. They left it for another time, when they could find some solid rock or lever to force it open with, and then spotted the overgrown remains of a road. From the look of it, you couldn't even call it a road. Merely 2 ruts carved out of the grass and underbrush, and certainly not used any time recent. Near the lean-to, there was a ringed fire pit with 2 enormous stones situated near it, obviously used as seating. Green blades of grass were growing in the middle of the pit, and it looked as though an old bird's nest had fallen down into it from the trees above. As far as the eye could see, there were trees and underbrush, slowly turning from dead winter brown to green in the wet coolness of spring. None of the other cabins had anything stocked inside them, just bare furniture, as thickly dust-covered as their cabin had been. Neither of the girls had any interest in exploring too far. Erin didn't have shoes, and both girls' feet were still sore and swollen. They stopped often and listened for any sounds, anything that indicated the presence of other people, soldiers or otherwise, but all they heard were the birds, the wind, and water rushing in the creek. They were utterly alone. In the end, they spent 6 weeks at the cabin, recuperating, growing strong, and improving their survival skills. Jess discovered she was a pretty fair shot, and Aaron became adept at fishing. They managed to supplement and extend the stock of food at the cabin with fresh, wild plants, and a good deal of fresh-caught fish and squirrel, rabbit, and even the lone wild turkey. At first, the idea of dressing game that they killed was disgusting and off-putting. Jess found she was more nauseous than ever, and Aaron had to take over all of the gutting and dressing so that her friend could keep most of their hard-earned food down. It was now obvious that Jess was pregnant, but it was something that neither of them spoke of. They didn't talk about Tent 5 or about their families or friends, and they rarely spoke of the future. But as their bodies healed, they fell into a quiet rhythm of survival. It was what they both needed. Time to heal mentally and physically. The days lengthened and grew warm. It was now mid-May, and Jess's belly was well-rounded, quite pronounced due to her thin frame, and her breasts were full. She had begun to help with field dressing their kills after her nausea eased up, but now she could feel the thing inside her kick. God, how she hated it. This parasite that made her sick shaped her body into something that was alien and awkward, and brought back memories she dearly wished to never revisit. Each time they tried some new food, some wild plant or mushroom that Aaron assured her was safe, Jess secretly hoped it would make her just sick enough for it to let go and disappear from her. That's how she pictured it, too, simply dissolving away some evening like a bad dream. She said nothing to Aaron of her feelings in this matter, although she was aware of her friend staring at her from time to time, on the verge of speaking of the taboo subject. She could barely stand to think of it herself. Better instead to simply survive and take one day at a time. They had managed to break into the small lean-to, and found that had served as a smokehouse at one time. Later use seemed to indicate that it was a catch-all for hunting and camping supplies, a gold mine for the girls who knew they would need to move on soon. They found a large tarp, miraculously whole despite the obvious signs of mice, an axe, rope, and a set of knives that Aaron immediately claimed would be far better suited to cleaning game than the knives stocked in the cabin. They cleared everything out of the smokehouse and decided to fire it up and smoke something. This resulted in some hilarious attempts at smoking and preserving the meat, first from the turkey they killed, a pitifully scrawny specimen, to more successful forays in smoked rabbit and squirrel. Aaron became so good at it that Jess had a hard time keeping up the supply of fresh game, until they turned to also smoking the fresh-caught fish. It was after a particularly large haul from the smokehouse that they found themselves dining on the last of the green beans. The propane stove would be too cumbersome to carry with them, and they were nearly out of the propane anyway, despite their careful conservation. So Aaron didn't object when Jess started it up and used it to heat not just the water, but the lone can of sweetened condensed milk. "It's time to move on, isn't it?" Jess said aloud, even though she knew the answer already. Aaron had been on a smoking and preserving kick, and with the supplies dwindling, it was time to leave. They had both known they couldn't stay here forever. "We've got a long way to go," Aaron said as way of an answer, "so I guess it's time we got started." There really wasn't anything more to say. The next day, they packed everything they could comfortably carry, rigging it on a length of tarp between two sturdy poles with leather straps lined with fur at either end. The straps fit over their shoulders, one girl in front, the other girl in the back to balance the load. The fur lining would be warm in the hot weather, but soft against their skin. Their supply of dried meat and fish would last for a while, a week or better before they needed more food, and it was in this way that they started off, both barefoot, their feet hardened by walking without socks or shoes for many weeks now. Jess refused to take the worn-out sneakers. It wasn't fair that Aaron had nothing and she did. They stripped the cabin of nearly anything that they could use and reasonably transport with them. As they left, the girls closed the door behind them, silently grateful to the unknown owner who had helped them to survive. The woods closed in around them. They followed the ruts in the overgrown path, and then turned back towards the creek. It was time to go home.